Hello there, so the introduction of the loved beatmap category was what we were all waiting for. Through its appealing approach of promoting maps that the community loves, while leaving out the hassle of the ranking process, it could potentially give players a chance to compete on maps that would otherwise never have gotten a scoreboard, and give exposure to mappers who created cool but unrankable content. Loved on launch appeared to act as a middle ground between the ranked section and the beatmap graveyard. That launch took place a bit over a year ago, on October 17th, 2016, to which I responded with a video speculating how the loved category and its perception would progress as time went on. My assumptions covered the new section's pros and cons, how it could promote map diversity, how it could discourage mapper improvement, how star priority lets experienced mappers have a bigger say in what maps are promoted, and how that goes against the thesis of loved altogether. Have my speculations held up? In some ways, yes, and in others, no. Loved has changed more than I initially expected over the last year, along with the kinds of maps it promoted and how the community perceived it, all of which I find worth dissecting here today. So, you know that tag game mode in multiplayer that you tried once and never again, probably? In the past, a few maps were designed specifically for tag gameplay, this being one of them. With a difficulty named Tag 4, it was supposed to be played by 4 people in multiplayer at the same time, and its object composition reflects that. The map begins with what is essentially a cross-screen 200 BPM stream, but because tag separates who plays which objects by new combos, 4 players on this map would only need to click their respective stacks. For its intended purposes, this was solid work, so it and a few other Tag 4 maps were approved back in the early days of Osu, around 2008 and 2009. Flash forward to February 2015, and these Tag 4 maps became what were, in essence, the first loved maps. Following the switch to the performance point system, all old approved maps were capable of earning players PP, even those ones designed for tag gameplay, which was proven to be a problem by Koovster. Despite not being a top player or even having a 300 PP score at the time, Koovster earned himself the world record highest PP score of 577 on this Tag 4 map, thanks to playing with a touchscreen. Simply put, normal play methods make this type of gameplay impossible, whereas touchscreen permits, well, this, which ignited controversy and led to the semi-unranking of Tag 4 maps. Yes, semi-unranking, because despite no longer rewarding PP, Tag 4 maps were still permitted a competitive leaderboard without unfairly affecting performance ranking. This midpoint between ranked and unranked led users to propose and massively support a feature request to create an entirely new beatmap category, which, as you could probably guess, influenced the creation of Loved a year later. When I said the introduction of the loved beatmap category was exactly what we were all waiting for, I meant it was exactly that. As a feature request proposed, this was a new category allowing the community to give leaderboards to maps that were unsuitable for rank, and the first batch of loved maps added right upon creation were exactly what the community had hoped for, a mix of highly popular maps that, for one reason or another, would likely never reach rank. Though they weren't the kinds of maps I particularly enjoyed, I agreed with everyone else on the whole concept of this new beatmap category. It was a solid addition that could shed light on maps previously promoted only through word of mouth. What I wasn't so fond of was the direction Loved went from here onwards. When thinking about Loved, I tend to mentally separate its timeline into a few distinct phases marked by how maps were promoted, each of which directly tied into what kinds of maps were loved and therefore how the community perceived the category. We will be holding community voting on a weekly basis to select the first number of maps to enter the Loved state. The initial 3-month phase of Loved promotion was handled entirely through this vote system, which worked, but not as effectively as people had hoped. The premise was easy to grasp at least. Each round, Osu staff would arrange 10 maps and let users vote on a maximum of 4 they would like to see in the Loved section. After a round ended, an unspecified number of winners were promoted, and that was that. Sounds okay, but I and a lot of others thought it had some issues. While announcements said rounds would be held weekly, that never turned out to be the case. For the 14 weeks voting was in place, only 4 votes were held, all at inconsistent time intervals. This may have made new loved maps more special, but it also left users with a bad taste in their mouths because the community wasn't entirely in charge of what few maps were put up for vote. The staff did pull from community threads listing maps, but the specific maps they chose weren't always what the masses wanted. Adding on to that, the voting system was designed to give community members a say in which maps were loved, but it barely functioned as that given how nearly equal favor was towards every option. In each of the rounds, the 10 map choices usually earned around 10% of the votes, meaning there were no outstanding winners or losers. While an announcement stated that only a few maps from each round would be promoted, a lot more than expected ended up loved, which I'd probably attribute to this even vote. 6 maps from the first 2 rounds passed, which could be 8 depending on how you look at it, and 7 maps from the last 2 rounds passed the vote. It seemed almost arbitrary, like scores were close, so voting voting had minimal impact and what really mattered was what maps were selected for the polls. Community input on the voting system aligns closely with what I just went over. People were generally happy with the loved category, but dissatisfied with how voting was conducted. Voting wasn't the end game for loved though. As hinted at multiple times, star priority was going to play a role in a more automated form of loved map promotion, which leads us to the second loved phase. We might be heading into esoteric mapping territory here, so stay with me. This, what I'll call star priority phase of Loved, lasted around 6 months and permitted map promotion based on a couple simple factors. 1, a map needed 30 favorites, and 2, a map needed 100 star priority. Favorites don't need an explanation. Click the button, number goes up. Star priority, however, might not be so obvious to non-mappers. To keep it as brief as possible, anyone can give mapping advice on a map's thread and earn kudos in return. That kudos both increases a map's star priority and can be used by a mapper as a kudos star, which further increases star priority. So basically, by getting this number up to 100 through mapping advice in stars, along with a simple 30 favorites, maps submitted through a form could enter Loved. From the public's viewpoint, this was a huge step down from the already less than stellar voting system, and it's also where most of my year-old speculation comes into play. Remember how players had minimal input in the voting system? In this phase, that was essentially flipped. Mappers had maximum input regarding which maps made it into Loved because they were the only ones with kudos to spend. Favorites were always easier to attain, but star priority was an obstacle that only people invested in mapping could influence, and that influence was considered over the top by the player masses. Without a limit on how many stars each user could contribute to a single map, we saw maps promoted to Loved by single people, defining the idea of Loved, promotion of widely appreciated maps. As would be obvious, this pissed tons of people off, resulting in a hatred for loved maps promoted through star priority. While I hadn't predicted the backlash it got, these problems with star priority promotion were part of my initial speculation, but with weaker impact. If the ratio were less in favor of star priority, perhaps this wouldn't have been an issue, though I recently learned why the numbers may have been so lopsided in the first place. On a podcast almost 2 months ago, a higher-up involved in Loved explained that kudos lacked purpose in the current mapping economy, and that Loved would be a way to revitalize it. Earning 100 kudos is a lot of manpower, so Loved promotion gave people a worthy reward for their efforts. Unfortunately, the driving principles behind Loved contradicted that idea, both for the reasons just explained and for a couple more. With a clearly discernible way to get maps loved, the new category shifted from a place where community favorites were sent to a place where mappers intentionally sought to promote their maps. Aiming for loved became a common phrase among mappers despite making no sense semantically. You can't just force people to love a map. That happens naturally, and that's what the first 3 months of loved maps showed. However, this did make the category a true midpoint between ranked and unranked maps, so loved at least remained in line with expectations in one way, which relates to another one of my year-old speculations, that loved would discourage mapper improvement. Ranking a map is an ambiguous process. Unless you know exactly what to do and have the connections to do so, you can't know for sure when you'll have your lucky break and get your map nominated. Loved, though, being so straightforward with its promotion process, let struggling mappers have an easy opportunity at map promotion. More mapping advice received leads to more star priority, so those who keep pushing could just naturally get their boring, subpar quality maps loved by ineffectively trying to rank them. And it should go without saying, this was something players loathed. In my speculation video, I also positively mentioned that map diversity would be a huge part of Loved. There would be tons of low quality maps, so the high quality ones would really stand out. I was completely wrong here. Diversity was still apparent, but the spotlight was on the worst and the most controversial maps instead. Players evaluated the love section based on the lowest common denominator, and so they treated it like garbage. Resulting from this player perception was a change in how mappers viewed Loved as well. A good portion of mappers didn't want their maps to be associated with the poor reputation Loved had, so they rarely made the push for promotion and left their maps for the graveyard. All that being said, Loved's intended relationship with star priority was a failure, and so this promotion phase ended after letting about 100 maps through. You'd think it could only go uphill from here, but at the end of the star priority phase, a thread was opened up to get community input on how Loved should progress, and from there, mappers and players voiced their concerns with the systems in place. Some of it was what we just went over, and there was also mention of stuff like inactive old maps being barred off from Loved. Acknowledging that star priority was not the way to go, staff put Loved on hiatus until a new system was formed. This phase is what I like to call the dead phase. For over 3 months, no maps were promoted to Loved and no actions were taken to revive it. Hiatus didn't mean Loved was completely out of mind though. Staff had shifted their priorities away from Loved onto modding V2 and the future of Laser for the time being, which was relayed to the public in that podcast I mentioned earlier. In not the most coherent way, this podcast was centered around the at the time dead Loved category, where it was discussed that public voting may come back at some point. And so a month later, pretty much now, it's actually happening. This time, things are slightly different though. Rather than being run by staff, this voting phase is more so run by the community. While the guy in charge of it, Toy, may be more well known than the average player, he still is a community member, and his choice of maps for this voting round is what made it possible. Being structured as the first voting phase though, this is by no means perfect. Voting rounds are infrequent, map selection isn't appreciated by everyone, and vote spread is fairly equal across the board. In this format, I don't think those problems will ever be going away, but I think most people can agree that if this captain's pick, that's what it's called, or something similar keeps up, Loved will be in a better situation than the star priority phase, and for sure, the dead phase. In an ideal world though, a happy medium between voting and star priority could be reached. Something that lets players have more input than just voting on pre-selected maps, and something less overpowered than single people pushing their maps with star priority. It's impossible to say whether a happy medium even exists though, given how long Loved has been around without that compromise in place. So, where will Loved go from here? If I had to speculate a bit more, just from this year onwards, I'd say the community will continue to handle Loved and staff will take more of a back seat. Staff have their priority list set, and Loved, which mostly appeals to a small number of invested players, is not near the top. Those invested players, however, could take over in their stead if they have enough interest and take the effort to work for it. That's the crowd-pleasing option, but what I'd be more interested in is the dropping of the whole Loved image. Under a new name and a new set of ideas, Loved could really just be the middle ground between ranked and unranked, where mappers can more easily promote their content, allowing star priority to once again have a purpose. Of course, I'm a mapper, I like that option because it appeals to mappers, but it doesn't at all take into account players. And that's probably because I don't think there's a situation where everyone can unanimously agree that map promotion is done correctly. Everyone has different map values, that divide being most extreme between players and mappers, and finding a system where everyone's values overlap is just not realistic. Personally, I have little investment in Loved maps in their current state because they primarily cater to non-mappers, with a competitive leaderboard being their main draw. But I am still interested in seeing what comes out of the Loved section just because of how much it changes and how those changes affect mapping. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.